We will be covering in this video the importance of objects and knowledge, sacred objects and knowledge coming out of the ancient records, and how this relates to the divine program of light. Primarily, the material I'm reading to you comes from 1999 and some portions from 1998. The Cathar stone is the ancient Celtic name for what was originally a foundation stone within the Rutan Sun Temple of Atlantis. Ruta was the only Atlantean isle which ascended at the time of Atlantis's final destruction in the time tsunami. The Cathar stone was taken from Atlantis near her end days and brought to the main Hebridean mystery temple on the Isle of Lewis. Here it remained for many centuries, serving as an energy node, facilitating the initiates in their consciousness connection with the Rutan ascended masters, their forefathers. It stood as a shining beacon of testimony to the authority of the temple craft in Albaon. Archetypally, the stone of destiny is the foundation stone of the temple. It bears the truth and proof of divine succession on the earth as it testifies in stone. In other words, the succession is recorded in matter, and the linkage to the spiritual hierarchy through the divine charge held within the stone allows certain individuals to access the Akasha and genetic information necessary to determine true Grail lineage and thus succession. There are various destiny stones located in many different countries, their origins being just as diverse. These other stones of destiny are usually pieces of original temple foundation stones which survived the various deluges. Just previous to and after the time of Atlantis' demise, Hibernia became the temple ground or centerpiece of sacred presence for all the Isles of Albaon. The priests and priestesses there were true representatives of the remaining light of the world, which had managed to remain comparatively pure and undefiled during the Atlantean conflicts between the Solarians and the Nephilim. I wish to pause in the reading here to say that Thoth's interpretation or usage of the word Nephilim is not just about Anunnaki. It has to do with a particular soul vibration embodied in the earth at various times. He also states that there are Nephilim that were not intrusive and negative, but they were few and far between, and he usually refers to them as free Nephilim, not free F-R-E, but P-H-R-E. So these free Nephilim actually were redeemed, or they came into true consciousness at some point in time. At certain times, Thoth is also referred to the Nephilimic Wars, and having to do especially with Atlantis and the Nephilim, but these Nephilimic Wars were more widespread than that. But he's never really gone into detail about it. To continue with the text, however, it was not long before the Dark Order made their shadow known on the Isles of Albaon as well. At first, they were not allowed upon Hibernia. The Dark Order attracted and largely brought their own following with them, but had no real authority with the indigenous people of the Isles, and their weaknesses were obvious. They conspired to destroy the Hibernian temple complex and to steal the Cathar stone. They wished to simply take over these temples for themselves, as the temples and grounds had been saturated with over 1,000 years of Metatronic Christic light work, such as chanting and working sacred Metatronic light matrices into the earth and stones of the sanctified structures. Thus these grounds and temples would not lend themselves well to the power violation of their dark deeds if left intact. The Dark Order decided to make it a hit-and-run affair instead. There was much intrigue and several failed attempts, but finally they were successful. Not only was the Cathar stone taken from its rightful abode, but the temples were greatly damaged. Although Hibernia would remain a temple ground for a period longer, it was never again to regain its former glory. Those who stole the stone falsely sought to claim succession from the Rutan priests and priestesses for themselves. It was broken into pieces and taken into Germania, or Germany, Scotland, and other locations to serve various tribes as a symbol of royal succession. Some of these claims to succession were valid, while others were merely manufactured to serve the goals of those who sought the power for themselves. I wish to pause in the reading here for a moment. The Dark Order that he's referring to, he's also referred to as the Anti-Grail family. So the Anti-Grail family and their satellites would have composed the Dark Order. Now, in the last video of this series, I will be addressing the Anti-Grail family, leading into our current situation in 2022 and what that portends and the light at the end of the tunnel. But for now, let us continue in the reading. A portion of the Cathar stone that was taken to Scotland was brought to Fortingall, where it still remains. Once it stood in the center of the Dearth Ben, or sacred circle at Arum Fortas, a name used for the ancient Grail settlement near the current town of Fortingall. This would be from the Thoth record, as I know of no historical Arum Fortas or Dearth Ben, but then I'm not a historian in Scotland chronology. It was taken out of the Dearth Ben when there was a threat to the Arum Fortas community and moved to another location. The stone was placed upon a sacred mound or hill not far from the current town of Fortingall, but has long since fallen over and is now buried through natural processes within this mound. Returning to the main thread of the story, not only was the main Cathar stone taken in pieces from the Hibernian temple site, but so were other stones from the temple buildings themselves. These stones were considered to contain the power of the sacred spiritual practices there, but when they were separated from the main temple and sacred ground that they had stood upon, the Dark Order was then able to violate that power and to use it for their own purposes. These stones now exist in all shapes and sizes, as most were hacked down for easy transport. They can be found in the British Isles as well as many other locations throughout the world. These temple stones were not considered to contain the power to determine the right to rule, as did the Cathar stone or stones, because it's now been cut into many pieces too, but they were nevertheless valuable talismans. Indeed, they do possess the sacred fire codes of the original Hibernian mysteries. And I wish to state here that they're not negative stones because the dark forces have used them. When they're not in the hands of the dark forces, they remain their powerful selves in regard to the codes that they create and contain. But if they are removed from their source matrix, which they were when they were taken from the temples, they, as talismans, they did have the ability to manipulate some things. Nothing really severe and evil, but, enough so that they were valued by the Anti-Grail family. This was not true with the Cathar stone, though. Even in pieces, it was far more difficult to use it for negative purposes. Not impossible, but more difficult. To continue, there is one part of the Cathar stone which is engraved with Rutan symbols, the capstone which was atop the original monolith in the Rutan Sun Temple. It is of the same monolithic meteor stone, but was originally quite highly polished, much more so than the rest of the stone. It is the piece which now lies beneath Arthur's true castle. It is very worn now, and the symbols are barely visible. Even by the time Merlin received it, this part of the stone had shown signs of being poorly cared for. This was due to the fact that for a very long period of time it had been in the possession of those who did not understand its true sacredness. This capstone portion is what later became known as the Terra Stone. There were 16 pieces of the Cathar stone originally in existence directly after it had been broken down by the raiding thieves. Some of the very small pieces which came into existence, the size of a silver dollar or so, were broken off the 16 larger original fragments later in time. As previously stated, the Cathar stone is of meteoric origin. Because various pieces have been exposed to vastly different environments throughout the passage of time, their coloration is not exactly the same now as it once was. There would be noticeable difference between them should they be placed side by side again today. They are mostly various shades of darkish green, some almost black with deep green highlights. Other pieces are more in the range of a dark gray. The original Cathar stone itself was cut from a large meteorite of which the inner part contained a higher concentration of iron than the remainder of the monolithic stone. The stone was cut from this meteor in such a way that the inner matrix was revealed cross-sectionally on one portion of it and was exquisitely beautiful when it was first crafted. Many of these pieces are currently lost beneath bogs or the ocean, some of the smaller fragments buried under ages of soil, etc. Eventually, 3 of these pieces returned to the British Isles via the adventures of the prophet Jeremiah, Princess T, and Baruch. Additional information on these entities to follow in this video. The first king of Israel, Saul, sought to kill the young David as he was jealous of the latter's favor among the people of Israel. As a result, David was forced to flee into the wilderness, where he became a Robin Hood figure of his day until Saul and his son Jonathan were killed in battle. At that point, David returned to eventually become king of Israel. During David's exile into the desert wilderness, he became disoriented from a fever. At that time he was alone and subsequently fell from a cliff. Unconscious, but not seriously injured, he awoke some time later to find himself in the care of an old hermit. The hermit had obviously been expecting the young man, as he told him many things about David's past, including that he was from the lineage of the Elbar kings, Atlantean Grail priest kings. The hermit proceeded to inform David that God had sent him, David, to this place so that what was rightfully his by succession could be placed into his keeping. The old hermit, who called himself Zebraduka, then led David to a small opening in a rock crevasse several miles away. The 2 men crawled in the dark some distance inside until they were able to stand. At this point, Zebraduka lit a torch to reveal a large cavern. In it, lying on its side, was the piece of Cathar stone containing the capstone. However, it was far too large to be moved by David and Zebraduka alone, nor could they have managed to drag it through the narrow passageway. Zebraduka told David to leave the stone where it was, and when he was ready to assume the throne of Israel, the stone would be delivered to him. David was disbelieving, and yet he had no choice but to leave the stone. Upon the day of his coronation, a team of men and horses delivered the stone to David. These men could not be persuaded to speak of their mission or that they had any knowledge of Zebraduka. Thoth also states in this article, I'm not reading you the entire article, that David, at the time he met Zebraduka, his incarnated entity consisted of only one soul. Before the day of his kingship, however, he would be latticed with 2 more souls, one being that of Thoth, Now, this latticing business is a bit dicey for me. I don't exactly understand it, but it's sort of like oversoul integrating, so that there are several souls operating in the higher spectrum for that individual. The body soul is still in control of the form and the character and the spiritual composition of that incarnation, but these lattice souls are more than just guiding spirits. They are really integrated into the spectrum of that whole entity. Zebraduka was a holy man and a prophet, but he was also Grail born and a member of a sacred order that kept track and guided Grail lineages into fruition, known in that day as the Order of Melchod-Sefer. However, it has been called by many other names and is in existence to this day as the Order of Zain, which is the name it was given by the shepherd kings of Egypt. The physical order of Zain comes directly under the inner planes order of Johannine Corpus of the Rose Mystica, and even more specifically under the branch of the order known as the Guild of Bethel. The Terra Stone, Stone of Destiny. The original Terra Stone of Ireland was part of the Cathar Stone, which had been broken into 3 pieces in order to transport it by sea to Ireland. Once the 3 pieces had arrived and had been carefully put back together, it stood at Terra. When this piece of the Cathar stone was reassembled, it contained the capstone portion of the original. After serving some time at Terra, it was dismantled once again for purposes of safekeeping. One of these pieces found its way to Fortingall, another to Arthur's Castle on the Isle of Man, and another became the original coronation stone of the Scottish kings. There was a later Terra stone which took the place of the first. It was not from the original Cathar stone, but rather was a regular temple stone from the Hibernian complex. Now, I then, in this issue of 1999, I go back and quote from 3 and 493 of Temple Doors. The Stone of Destiny, speaking of the Terra Stone, is a representation of the cornerstone of the future temple contained within the 2 arcs, the Ark of Grace, that's the sacred On, and the lesser version Thoth refers to as the Ark of Karma. Pepper and Wilcox, the authors of Magical and Mystical Sites, recount an invasion of the Tuatha De Danann by the Milesians, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who sailed from Corona in Spain. They came in a fleet of 30 ships bearing a flag depicting a dead serpent and the rod of Moses. The record of Thoth reveals that the Danann, or tribe of Dan, were in conflict with the invading generation of Ashur, the Milesians. This is something that occurred in pre-Davidic times. Together they had once been charged as guardians of the cornerstone. The Ashur Milesians had come not to avenge the death of a chief, as legend says, but to assume what they considered to be their rightful powers through the cornerstone of the future temple. They won at least the terrestrial battle. Magical and Mystical Sites states, the legend says that the Tuatha De Danann disappeared, retreating into caves and underground haunts, unquote. Thoth declares that at first they did go underground, but eventually stepped through the veil as they increasingly intermingled with the original she-fairy nature beings until both became one. Returning to the 1999 issue of Temple Doors, while the Danann did not have the true physical right to rule stone, when the Milesians attacked, they did possess the signs and seals which gave them authority over this stone in spirit. They also possessed some of the other Hibernian temple stones. Milesians sought to claim this right to rule and to usurp the territory of the Danann with it. The Milesians controlled much of Ireland by the time Jeremiah and Princess T arrived with the parts of the stone they possessed. However, the Milesians continued to allow certain remaining segments of the Tuatha De Danann tribes to officiate as priests and priestesses over the sacred sites, for they had come to a reckoning with the right of the Danann as keepers of the sacred, so long as they, the Milesians, were rulers of the sacred. In a book entitled The Stone of Destiny by Pat Gerber, there is an ancient Bible story related about a Princess T, that's Tea, and a prophet Jeremiah fleeing to Egypt from a besieged Israel around 585 BC with the stone. She was Tefi, but Thoth also calls her Tefi. Princess T was the daughter of the king of Israel, Zedekiah, from the house of David. The prophet Jeremiah, along with Princess T and Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch or Simon Brek, left Egypt just ahead of the invading Nebuchadnezzar. Pat Gerber speculates that their only course under the desperate situation would have been to embark upon a journey by sea, likely being transported by the seafaring Phoenicians, whom he refers to also as the tribe of Dan. Pat Gerber goes on to relate another historical accounting of an old prophet having landed at Ulster in Ireland, which is at the north edge of the Phoenicians' west coast sea route. He was called Olham Fodhal by the people of Ulster, meaning professor, doctor, or learned man. This historical accounting tells us that he was made a king in the year 526 BC. The record of Thoth also reveals that Jeremiah founded a school of prophets in the region of Tara, where he established laws which were apparently based on the Ten Commandments. According to Pat Gerber, in the Stone of Destiny, the princess also arrived with an impressive harp, which he goes on to point out was, quote, once the emblem of David, later the emblem of Ireland, unquote. It is said that this harp is still buried at Tara, where the Cathar stone pieces, which the Irish call the Lia Fail, were reassembled and positioned as a talisman of power. This would be the Tara stone. The original Phoenicians were descended from Atlanteans, as were the tribe of Dan, and they had some Dan kinsmen among them. However, the Phoenicians were largely a mixed people by the time of Jeremiah and Princess T's arrival in Alba-on. Jeremiah and Princess T did bring the piece of the Cathar stone, which had been in Solomon's temple, containing the capstone portion of the whole original Cathar stone, back to the Isles of Alba-on. It had been their intention to take it all the way to Hibernia, but they were blown off course in a violent storm and cast ashore in Ireland. There they remained. Let us take a closer look at the story as revealed by the record of Thoth. Princess T was indeed a descendant of David and Solomon, her father being King Zedekiah of Israel, as indicated in the aforementioned book. The stone had remained in the family since the days of David. The situation developing in Jerusalem necessitated the removal of the stone from the area. Princess T, Jeremiah, and the scribe Baruch, or Simon Brek, managed to quickly move the stone to the Isles of Alba-on. The expediency of their transport of this large stone under duress was made possible by the following circumstances. At the time of Nebuchadnezzar's final siege of Jerusalem, there had already been several attempts to take the city. This was the fatal blow in a long struggle between the two nations. Consequently, the stone and many of the other sacred treasures had already been removed from the temple in Jerusalem and were sequestered in caves within the desert near the Dead Sea. Once the three refugees and their small company of servants reached the hidden caves, they were able to collect the stone and some other rare artifacts and scrolls before departing for Egypt. Although the stone was heavy, they had made preparations in advance to transport it. They also knew some techniques for making objects lighter in weight through the use of vibrational harmonics. The process may have been tedious, but they were successful, for they had help along the way from the members of the order of Zain. Nebuchadnezzar very much wanted this treasure above all others in the taking of Jerusalem, and was expected to try and obtain it at any cost. Nebuchadnezzar was quite anxious to possess the Cathar stone, as it was a talisman of power, a kingmaker. Also, Nebuchadnezzar had read the scrolls of Sennacherib, a prior Assyrian ruler, in which the latter had spoken of another Rutan stone that had become the cornerstone of the Temple Khnibur in the ancient Rutan Assyrian city of Khofra. The city of Nineveh would later be built by Ashurbanipal II atop the ruins of Khofra. This according to Thoth. There's no historical documentation that I know about a city named Khofra. To quote from issue 3 and 4 of 1992 Temple Doors regarding Sennacherib's written account of his dream as translated from the record of Thoth. There from the gate of Sivana came a world maker, striding a raven of molten fire, blocking the sun with his mighty form. Near the base of his left foot there arose the Kab, holy etheric stone, spitting forth red fire from the center of the earth. I was prostrate upon the ground, drenched in the dew of his brow. As I stretched to touch the stone, he spoke to me in lightning. No man shall touch the stone until the day of man is risen, for herein is the verse of life that was lost in the first day of the world, and shall not be sung until the last day is upon the kingmakers. I was fearful and lay upon the ground. In my heart I knew I was not the one to make the stone sing. To continue in 1999, therefore Nebuchadnezzar knew the true cosmic power of such Rutan temple stones, and would go to the ends of the earth to obtain one of them. When they reached the Egyptian port, they wasted no time, for they knew Nebuchadnezzar might easily catch up with them. Arrangements had been made prior to their arrival to leave on Phoenician ships for the Isles of Abalon, the British Isles. It was at this point that the stone was hewn into 3 pieces, one portion to be placed on each of the 3 ships. This accomplished, the 3, Princess T, Jeremiah, and Barak, separately boarded one of the ships, each with a 1/3 portion of the stone. Now, I pause here to say that now I know, more recently, and I mean really just last year, that there were more ships than the 3 that carried the stones. There were 2 more ships. And these 2 ships have another story attached to them, which we'll get to later. To continue, the reason they chose the Isles of Albaon as their destination was because of Princess T's mother, whose true name was Ariella. She had been from a tribe of people who had migrated originally from Hibernia. Jeremiah had been Arielle's, actually it's more with an I on the end than an A, Arielle's guardian and mentor, and as such had been included in the dowry of the marriage agreement between Arielle and Zedekiah, along with some ancient scrolls relating the history of the Cathar stone, the Hyberian temples, and the ancient Rutan province of Atlantis. The scrolls mentioned a remaining temple colony on the Isle of Lewis, which, according to Jeremiah's visions, they believed still existed. Jeremiah was a true seer, and thus his visions carried a great deal of influence. If this were true, they reasoned that they would be rejoining a family branch of their Grail lineage and returning the right to rule to the land destined to receive the sacred stone at that time. Thus, the primary directive of Jeremiah's visions was that he, Baruch, and Princess T must return the stone to the sacred temple ground of Hibernia. This was God's will. Jeremiah's visions indicated that the Grail lineage of David had been violated and Princess T's family murdered because the stone had been torn from its sacred place by the Dark Order many centuries before, thus setting certain karmic forces into motion. In order to put things right for themselves and for the people and family they left behind, they knew they must return the stone and teach the lost colony what they knew concerning their shared heritage. This was how Jeremiah interpreted his visions. Once they had been at sea for a while, however, he began to realize that something was wrong. He grew restless and could not sleep or eat. Princess T and Barak feared for the older man's life and sanity. Then a storm came upon them. It was during this storm that Jeremiah suddenly realized they had been heading for the wrong island. With his newfound insight, he now saw that they would not reach Hibernia, but by the hand of God would be placed in the midst of the true people of Ireland, who were the rightful guardians of the great stone of David, the Cathar stone. Even though it seemed that their lives were in great peril during the storm, the prophet was at peace now, for he knew that God would bring them to the shore of the old ones, the race of the Elbar kings, from whom David had descended, his Atlantean descendants. The Danann were called by other names previous to this time, but they were essentially the same people and had originated in Hibernia, although their distant ancestors were Hyperborean Atlanteans. I wish to again pause in the reading to share something that came to me rather dramatically just a few weeks ago. And I won't go into all the details of how it came about, but I will say that I was shown how a Tuatha De Danann priest was given visions that Jeremiah would be landing on the shores of their land. Now, he didn't particularly know that the name was Jeremiah, but he knew that this priest would be coming to them, prophet, priest, and he was even awakened the day that he would come and given the hour to stand on the shore to await him, to await his arrival. And he gave a certain sign with his hand when Jeremiah stepped off the ship and waded to shore, because he was the first one that did. And the two priests from the tribe of Dan, one from Israel and one mixed with the Tuatha De Danann, but the tribe of Dan of Ireland, met face to face, and the Tuatha gave him a sign with his hand that was recognized by Jeremiah, and he returned the sign. And this was the seal of the covenant was given, and the two people were united as one. To continue with the reading, Jeremiah was recognized for who he was by the holy men and women of the Danann, and the Milesians were inclined to believe the Danann in this matter as well. Jeremiah was made a Grail priest king. The Milesians may have been off course in their usurpation of Ireland through the violent centuries earlier, but they did recognize the spiritual authority of the righteous ones in certain matters. They knew that they had beheld Jeremiah, so they beheld a holy man and a guardian of the sacred stone. Jeremiah was recognized for who he was by the holy men and women of the Danann, and the Milesians were inclined to believe the Danann in this matter as well. Jeremiah was made a Grail priest king. The Milesians may have been off course in their usurpation of Ireland through violent centuries earlier, but they did recognize the spiritual authority of the righteous ones in certain matters. They knew that as they beheld Jeremiah, so they beheld a holy man and guardian of the sacred stone. The Milesians were also from the generations of Ruda, and thus the Hibernian holy people, as were the Danann. They had mixed feelings in regard to the terrible battle and defeat of the Danann at their hands centuries earlier. Many among the wise ones of the Milesians felt that God would curse them for this act against their brethren. Thus Jeremiah arriving with the stone was a sign of saving grace for them. While Jeremiah may not have been directly related to David, although indirectly he was, as they were all Grail born, he was directly related to the Danaan, as was Princess T. Because of the Danaan blood in their veins, Jeremiah, Princess T, and Barak were able to naturally live very long lifespans without the more usual advanced signs of aging. In Ireland, Princess T became regarded as a Grail queen in her own right and was recognized for her Davidic Grail blood. However, as was the custom of the Milesians of that time, she was not revealed openly, but instead was represented in all outer manners by the priest-king Jeremiah, a carryover from the Missouri traditions which came down through the Morgs. The Morgs were sacred women. Their ancestors had been Grail queens, and now they were the ones who decided who would be king, who would carry the lineage forth. The stone may have been part of a ceremony and the foundation of that kingship, but they were the ones who made the kings. So to continue, Jeremiah indeed established the school of prophets at Tara, Ireland. This was a mystery school of both Mazarothic and Atlantean Grail consciousness. It was called Halifia, meaning to bring forth into the light. While it was not one of the 12 ordained Mazarothic mystery schools, it nevertheless played a key role in seeding the Earth's consciousness with the mystery of the Mazaroth. Now, again, to pause, this whole issue that I'm reading from is about the mystery of the Mazaroth. It talks about the 12 mystery schools and all of this, so that's what's being referred to here. This school of prophets hosted many souls who would carry to fruition knowledge gathered in the smelting pot of the Halifia focus. These souls carried this knowledge in many forms and in many lands through their various subsequent incarnations. The Halifia were not considered by the hierarchy to be one of the officially ordained 12 mystery schools because it was a later completion of the earlier Hyberian mystery school, which was one of the primary 12. I found this one and only image of Princess T on the internet, and with it is stated Tamara T. Thefi, 684 BC to 595 BC, Queen of Ireland, Princess of Judah. Thefi was a princess of Judah from her father's lineage, and she was a princess of Dan from her mother's lineage. They were both Grail families. Aside from preserving the Cathar stone and other sacred records, very select because they didn't have a lot of room in all of those ships, they were about preserving the genetics, the bloodline, the Grail bloodline. Now again, we need to look at this from the perspective of the time and also what they acknowledged they were carrying from as far back as actually Lemuria. Now maybe they didn't know about Lemuria by then or Atlantis by then, but they knew that there were distant histories in which their lineage had begun. At this period of time, at least with Princess T and Jeremiah and those who went with them to this land of Ireland, they were not about the kind of preserving of the royal lineage so that they could all be fat and happy and their children were going to be the rulers of the world. That wasn't the mindset. It may be now in some ways, in places, but it was not then. They were preserving something for humanity. Now, maybe they didn't understand it entirely by then. A lot had been lost, but they still kept track of it. And there were certain ancient texts which were on the boats that helped them to keep track of it and understand that it did have importance for all of humanity. So when the royals from Israel arrived on the shores of Ireland, and they met with their kinsmen, both the Tuatha De Danann and the Milesians, they knew that one of their tasks, let's say, was to procreate, to bring these lineages that had been separated for a long time and mixed in other ways together. It wasn't about creating some pure race. It was about bringing the bloodline of the sacred Grail of Melchizedek into all races of mankind. There were more royals in the boats than just Princess T. There were her family, or members of her family, not her whole family. Many of them had to be left behind and were probably killed in the raids or taken prisoner. And this was a matter of choice, who chose to stay behind. But there was her younger sister, there was an aunt who was still of childbearing age at the time, because remember, they lived so much older, and so they were childbearers much older. Princess T's last child was born when she was 80 years old, and believe me, she didn't look 80 years old. She looked about 40. So there were others present, and male members as well, but there weren't a lot of them. The boats were only so big, and they had to have stones and other things in them, you know. And of course, two of the boats went off in another direction. Again, we're going to explore that in the next video. So they each had a lot of propagating to do. And it's not like they were trying to, you know, break some kind of a record. But, you know, Princess T only had 4 children. So it wasn't a lot of children, but it was with the right people. Her first consort was actually a husband, and there was a certain deeper love between them. And he did pass away. I never got what from, but not long after she was pregnant with her only child by him, he died. That would have been a son. And then she arranged to have another pregnancy by another Tuatha De Danann. All these were, the first 2 were Tuathas. And that was twin boys. And then the third and last child, a girl, was much later, when she was 80 years old, by another man. And she wasn't partners with these other 2 fellows. This was purely spiritual genetic business that they were about. The first husband, or the first man in her life of that nature, was more of a spiritual romantic partner, because they certainly were capable of having that. So it wasn't like they were like busy bees just procreating all over the place, but they did have a mission, and it involved, among other things, the continuation of the lineage. It is noteworthy to mention that one of the twin boys of Princess T's began to follow darker guidance, and he was eventually banned from his community and went on to practice the darker rituals and magic. And he didn't become super evil. I kind of don't know how to categorize how evil he was, but he had a good heart in many ways. He was very misled. We understand how people can become very misled, especially now in 2022, and do things they would never have thought of doing, commit dark deeds they would never have thought of doing, you know, until they were infiltrated and mind controlled, basically. Yes, they had a certain weakness to begin with, but it could have been, you know, something that worked out. And otherwise, it was not that way because they were influenced strongly. Well, that was the case with this young man. He was targeted because he was the weak link. And that is another story. So I wish to conclude this episode in the video series with some additional imaging.